Welcome back to 4547blog.com presents the New Conservative Radio Show. I'm your host, NINJ, and tonight we're asking a question that cuts deeper than party politics, deeper than headlines, it's deeper than the social media outrage itself. And it's who actually governs America. Is it the Constitution, or is it shifting demographics with identity blocks? Is it political strategy and selective enforcement? Because if you strip away the noise, everything we're debating right now, faith, borders, voter ID, the SAVE Act, Fulton County, interstate migration, it all comes back to one thing, and that's structure. The United States was founded as a constitutional republic, not a theocracy. It's not a collection of competing legal systems. It's not a nation governed by tribal categories. Okay, the Constitution is the supreme law of the land. That is the starting point. Religious demographics are changing in America. Christianity remains dominant in raw numbers, but Islam is growing largely throughout the immigration population, and the birth rates are rising in their community, and that demographic is reality. But growth is not the issue. Governance is. No religious doctrine, Christian, Muslim, Jewish, or otherwise, governs this country. Civil law governs this country. Freedom of religion is protected. Religion is not the rule of law in America. Sharia law does not override constitutional law. Biblical law does not override constitutional law. There's no religious system that supersedes the Constitution in America, and that line is firm, and it must remain firm when we move to the ballot, to the SAVE Act, proof of citizenship, voter ID. Everything in Fulton County. The public trust in elections is always been being looked at, but now it's under a microscope since, Fulton County was raided. Federal law already prohibits non-citizens from voting. The debate is about enforcement. It's about verification. It's about legitimacy. The underlying principle is citizens decide the laws of this nation. That is what sovereignty is. Without confidence in elections, legitimacy erodes. When legitimacy erodes, stability weakens, and that weakness does not care about your party. Add that to interstate migration. Americans relocating from high tax states to lower tax states. It's shifting congressional seats. It's shifting Electoral College math. It's shifting local political cultures. Demographics move power in America. That is not theory. That is arithmetic. But sovereignty isn't due to hate. Verification isn't suppression, and defining citizenship isn't discrimination. It is structural preservation of what we already have in place in this country. In this country, citizenship is a civic identity. You can honor your heritage. You can celebrate your ancestry. You can practice your faith freely. But politically and legally, you are an American if you are a citizen of America. The Constitution does not recognize, hyphenated voting rights. It recognizes citizenship. It recognizes its citizens. The ballot does not ask your ancestry. It recognizes only citizenship. When identity becomes tribal, politics become fractional. When citizenship becomes primary, unity becomes possible. Heritage is personal. Citizenship is civic. And under the law, there is not competing prefixes. There is one shared political identity, and that is American. So tonight, we're here to define ballots, borders, and the Constitution. And the question that really matters, who actually governs America? Because before we talk about voter ID, before we talk about the SAVE Act, before we talk about Fulton County or migration or demographic shifts, we have to establish something fundamental. We have to set a ground rule. Let's clear something up immediately. The moment you bring up religion in America today, people try to shut the conversation down. They say you're attacking faith, or you're stoking division, or you're a fearmonger, right? But no, this is not about that. It's not about attacking anyone's faith. It's about American law. America was founded, it was founded as a republic. It is not a theocracy. It was not founded as a religious republic. It was not founded as some patchwork of competing belief systems fighting for dominance. It was founded as a constitutional republic. And that means something. It means the Constitution governs, not pastors, not imams, not rabbis, not activists, not political tribes, just the Constitution. The founders understood factions. They understood religious conflict, and that's why they built a system where belief is protected. But governance is bound by written civil law. Freedom of religion is guaranteed. Freedom to govern by religion is not. That distinction is the firewall, because the second civil law bends to religious doctrine, any doctrine, you no longer have equal protection under the law. You have hierarchy. You have fragmentation. You have competing authorities, and competing authorities are how republics fracture. This country has Christians, Muslims, Jews, atheists, spiritual people, millions of Americans with different beliefs. That diversity only works because one document sits above all of it, and that's the Constitution. The Constitution does not change based on demographic growth or shift because one faith rises or another declines. It does not adapt to pressure from ideological movements. It's the framework, and when identity begins to outrank citizenship, when belief begins to pressure governance, instability follows. So understand the foundation before we move forward. You can believe what you want, but when it comes to governing the United States, there is one authority: civil law under the fucking Constitution. That line is not anti-religious. It's pro-republic. It's pro-America. And everything else we discussed tonight rests on that line. And once we establish that civil law governs, once we make it clear that the Constitution is not optional, the next question hits even harder. What happens when the demographics change? What happens when religious composition inside the country, it shifts? Does the structure bend? No, it doesn't. And it can't. Let's deal in reality. Religious demographics in America are shifting. Christianity remains the dominant in raw numbers, but its percentage share has declined over time. Islam is growing, largely through immigration and higher birth rates. That's not propaganda, that's actual census math. Growth is not the threat. Governance is the issue. America operates on constitutional supremacy. If one faith grows, the Constitution doesn't change. If another declines, the Constitution doesn't change. The immigration patterns fluctuate. The Constitution remains the same. Civil law does not negotiate with religious growth curves. That's the firewall to our Constitution, because the second governance starts bending to religious expectations, any religion for that matter. You no longer have a neutral state. You have factions competing for influence. And history is very clear about what happens when factions believe their doctrine should shape public law. Instability always follows. Islam growing in America does not mean America becomes Islamic, and Christian decline in percentage doesn't mean Christian influence disappears completely. The structure of governance is not tied to the religious headcounts. But America has the right to ask a very serious question, and that is, are we protecting the boundary between private belief and public law with absolute clarity? Because once the boundary softens, once courts begin entertaining parallel legal standards, once political leaders hesitate to affirm constitutional supremacy, you create confusion. And confusion inside a republic is dangerous. No mosque, church, or synagogue runs this country. They don't govern this country. The Constitution governs this country, and it governs equally, regardless of which religion is growing, shrinking, or holding steady in America. Religious freedom only survives when government stays neutral and firm. If neutrality weakens, freedom weakens. So this isn't about fear of Islam. It isn't about nostalgia for Christian dominance. It's about refusing to let governance drift towards fractional influence, because when civil authority stays clear, religious diversity works. When it blurs, the entire system destabilizes. And that brings us to the next pressure point. If the Constitution governs, the citizens shape the Constitution through elections. When citizenship itself becomes the critical gate, who votes? Who verifies? Who even enforces? And where this moves from faith to the ballot, and that's where this gets serious. Because once you say the Constitution governs, once you say civil law is supreme, you have to be willing to defend that principle when it's tested. You don't defend constitutional supremacy in theory. You defend it at the boundary lines. And one of the loudest boundary line debates in America today is about Sharia law. So let's deal with it directly. The truth is, stripped of all the fucking noise, Sharia law has no authority in American constitutional governance. None at all. Article 6 of the Constitution is clear. No religious test for office. The First Amendment is clear. No establishment of religion. That means the United States government does not enforce Christian law. It does not enforce Islamic law. It does not enforce any religious doctrine as civil authority. Civil law governs civil authority. Now, Critics hear the word Sharia and immediately assume some kind of hysteria because supporters sometimes downplay it as irrelevant, but reactions miss the structural point. The issue is not whether Sharia currently governs America. It doesn't. The issue is whether the boundary remains unmistakable. Private religious ambition exists across multiple faiths in America. Jewish Beth Din courts, fucking Christian mediation systems, Islamic arbitration panels. Individuals can agree to settle private disputes through these religious frameworks that is protected under freedom of contract and freedom of religion. But here's the non-negotiable line. No private religious agreement can override constitutional rights. No arbitration rule or ruling can supersede the federal law. No religious doctrine can strip someone of equal protection under the Constitution. If any religious framework or any faith attempts to push beyond private practice into public authority, the answer must be immediately and firmly no. Because once civil law yields to religious authority, even in narrow ways, precedent starts to form. The precedent spreads. This country works because the Constitution sits above belief, not against belief, but above it. The courts do not interpret Scripture. They interpret statutes. They interpret the Constitution. That neutrality is what protects everyone. Christians are protected because government does not enforce Islam. The Muslims are protected because government doesn't enforce Christianity. Atheists are protected because government doesn't enforce either one. It's neutrality that is the strength of America. And the moment, neutrality wavers is the moment politicians become hesitant to affirm constitutional supremacy over religious doctrine. Instability always follows. This is not anti-religion. This is anti-theocracy. It is pro-equal protection. It's pro-constitutional order. If civil law is supreme, and if the Constitution governs all equally, then the mechanism by which we shape that law becomes sacred. The ballot, who casts it, who verifies it, who enforces its integrity. Because once governance is constitutional, the next battlefield is electoral legitimacy. And that takes us directly to citizenship and the SAVE Act. And once we establish the civil law that governs, that no religious doctrine overrides the Constitution, the next question becomes unavoidable. If the Constitution is supreme, who gets to shape it? Who gets to vote? Who gets to decide the direction of the nation? Because if governance is constitutional, then elections are the mechanism. And if elections are the mechanism, citizenship is the gate. It's the key that opens up your abilities here in America. So let's talk the SAVE Act. Strip away the headlines, strip away the outrage. The SAVE Act requires documentary proof of U.S. citizenship to register to vote in federal elections. That's it. Federal law already prohibits non-citizens from voting in federal elections. That's not controversial. That's already established law. The debate is not about whether non-citizens should even vote. They legally cannot. The debate is about enforcement. Supporters of the SAVE Act know it's going to strengthen verification. It's going to close loopholes. It's going to restore confidence in the system. The Democrats argue it creates, documentation burdens. They argue it risks disenfranchising eligible voters who may lack immediate access to paperwork. That's the most racist thing I've ever heard. They argue administrative complexity could cause errors. That's the policy fight. But underneath the policy language is something much more fundamental. It's our sovereignty. In a constitutional republic, citizens determine the laws that govern them. If you're not a citizen of the United States, you do not vote on federal law. That principle is not extreme. It's foundational. The ballot is not a participation trophy. It's not symbolic. It's not global. It's the instrument by which a sovereign people govern themselves. A sovereign people being Americans. And when proof of citizenship becomes controversial, people start asking why. Is verification suppression? Or is verification structural integrity? Confidence in elections isn't as important as mechanics. You can run a technically lawful election, but if half the country believes the system is porous, then trust erodes. And once trust erodes, legitimacy fractures. When legitimacy fractures, stability weakens. The SAVE Act is not about religion. It's not about race. It's not about identity. It is about whether citizenship has meaning in the ballot box. Because if citizenship becomes symbolic, if enforcement becomes optional, then the line between citizen and non-citizen blurs. And when that line blurs, our own sovereignty as Americans weakens. This is not about exclusion. It's about definition. A nation that cannot define who votes cannot define who governs. And that takes us directly into the next pressure point, which is voter ID, because if citizenship matters, then verification, it better matter too. If citizenship is the gate, if the ballot belongs to citizens, if sovereignty depends on definition, then verification is not optional. It's structural, because a right that cannot be verified becomes vulnerability. If you remove the bullshit, you need identification to board a plane. You need identification to open a bank account, to purchase age-restricted goods, to enter a federal building. But when it comes to voting, the act that determines the direction of the country, suddenly verification becomes controversial. Why? Supporters of voter ID laws argue something simple. If you're casting a ballot that shapes federal law, you should be able to verify who you are. That's not suppression. That's security. That's why the Democrats argue voter ID is going to risk disenfranchising eligible voters who may lack government-issued identification. Tell me who these people are, other than some kind of fantasy in their head. They point to access issues, cost concerns, and historical inequities. This isn't 1919. Everybody walks around with an ID nowadays. If you want to go into the club, you have to have an ID. If you want cigarettes or you want to drink a beer, you have to have an ID. Doesn't matter if you're in the hood. You get pulled over by the police, they're asking you, where's your ID? If you don't have one, they're going to arrest you. They're going to verify who you are. But that's the argument, and it's a serious one. It deserves to be addressed honestly. And the tension that fuels the entire debate is one side prioritizes maximal access while the other one prioritizes maximal verification. Access without verification invites vulnerability. Verification without access, it risks exclusion. That is the philosophical divide, but here's the reality that can't be ignored. If elections lose public confidence, participation is going to decline even more. If participation declines more, legitimacy, it erodes even more. And if legitimacy erodes even more, the stability of the whole system is going to weaken to a point where it can be fractured. Voter ID is not just about preventing fraud. It's about reinforcing confidence, because even if documented fraud is rare, like they say, perceived vulnerability damages trust. So we want to make sure that we're doing everything we can so that we can be in the up and up. Fulton County became a symbol because it's ground zero for suspicion. Let's not sugarcoat it. When the FBI executes a search warrant tied to election activity, it's not just routine bureaucracy. A federal judge does not sign off on a warrant because someone was concerned. Investigators literally have to show probable cause, sworn evidence, that a federal crime may have occurred and that the evidence likely exists in a very specific place. That's very serious. And if you separate the emotion from the law, probable cause is not proof of outcome-altering fraud, but it is authorization to dig where they think they could have proof of it. And what that absolutely does mean is there was enough smoke to justify looking for the fire. And when that happens inside of a county that already became the epicenter of a national suspicion, the damage only multiplies, because elections don't operate on legal technicalities alone. They operate on confidence. You can certify results. You can win in court, you can dismiss lawsuits, but if federal judges are executing warrants in the background, the public does not interpret that as everything was perfect. We interpret it as instability, and instability is very corrosive. This is where both sides fail our country. One side screams proof before investigations conclude, and the other side is screaming nothing to see here before investigations conclude. Both reactions inflame, The disciplined position is harder and more brutal. If crimes occur, prosecute them aggressively. If procedures were sloppy, expose them publicly. If allegations collapse under evidence, say so without any hesitation. But don't pretend federal scrutiny is meaningless. Don't bring federal investigators into election matters lightly. When that level of scrutiny happens in a county central to the national election dispute, trust doesn't quietly heal, it fractures, you know? Everyone else is looking at this situation from the outside and making judgments. Fulton County became more than geography, you know, inside of America. It became a symbol of doubt within our election system. Not because every alteration was proven, but because the system appeared strained, opaque, and reactive instead of airtight and confident, which it should be. Here in America in the year 2026, I don't know what the heck we're doing. But, you know, once confidence breaks, every future election inherits the same suspicion. That's why verification debates are intensifying. That's why voter ID has exploded nationally. And that's why the SAVE Act has gained traction. People don't demand reinforcement when they feel secure. They demand it when they feel uncertainty. And uncertainty with elections is not a minor problem. That's a structural threat to America itself. Because when half of the country doubts the system, whether those doubts are fully substantiated or not, the Republic absorbs the stress of it, and the stress accumulates. Fulton County wasn't just about ballots. It was about trust. And trust, once it cracks, does not repair itself with, you know, press releases. When you strip away the bullshit, Democrats argue the voter ID laws can create barriers. They argue that some eligible voters may lack current identification. They argue the documentation requirements could disproportionately affect lower income communities. They argue America has a history of restricting ballot access, and they do not want to repeat it in the year 2026. They're fabricating shit that doesn't even exist, and they're pretending, and people are actually listening. That's the state of America right now. That's their stated position. And if you're going to debate seriously, you have to acknowledge the stupidity of their argument honestly. Now, the conservative movement or the conservative argument, it's verification protects legitimacy. Clear standards protect the trust, and uniform requirements protect the structure of our systems. Because, you know, access without safeguards invites vulnerability. Again, vulnerability invites doubt. This is not a cartoon villain story, guys. This is a philosophical divide about risk. One side prioritizes maximum participation, even with verification standards that are looser. And the other prioritizes maximal verification, even if participation requires additional steps. Access versus assurance. That's the real fight. But here's where it becomes political. Elections are not just, you know, civic rituals. They're power transfers. And we all know that. We see the difference when the power actually transfers from a Democrat to a Republican. Every structural rule, you know, ID requirements, registration process, mail-in ballot standards, and, you know, they all have political consequences. Both parties know that, which is why this debate never stays technical. It becomes existential. Democrats frame voter ID as a barrier to inclusion. They're always talking about this inclusion word. But Republicans frame the absence of voter ID as the vulnerability to the system, which is rightful. And the country watches both sides accuse the other of undermining democracy. So where do you draw the line? How much verification is enough? How much access is enough? And who decides when the balance is right? Because the tension between participation and protection is not going away. It's shaping every midterm, every presidential race, every state contest. And when you add interstate migration to that equation, then populations shift. And when electoral maps change, then the stakes get even higher because power moves when people move. And once you understand that elections are power transfers, once you understand that rules shape outcomes, once you understand that participation and verification are in constant tension, you have to add one more factor to the equation, and that's movement. Because power doesn't just shift at the ballot box, it shifts when people physically pack up and move. And Americans are relocating at historic levels, from high tax states to lower tax states, from heavily regulated economies to states advertising freedom and opportunity, from dense urban cores to suburban and rural areas. It's not ideology, it's literal census data. But here's what makes it politically explosive, okay? Population determines power. When residents leave one state and flood to another, congressional seats shift. Electoral college votes, they shift. State legislative controls shift. Demographics are not abstract, they're arithmetic. Florida gains strength, Texas gains leverage. Other states lose representation. And when people move, they don't just bring, their furniture. They bring voting habits. And that's the uncomfortable conversation most politicians dance around. If large numbers of voters relocate from one political environment to another, does the destination state remain politically stable? Or does it begin to resemble the state that those people just left, like Colorado? Because Colorado is now California because of all the people who immigrated from California and brought their voting habits to Colorado. The question is not hostility. It's strategic reality. States compete, not just economically, but politically. And when internal migration reshapes voting blocks, every future election changes. The maps change. This isn't about demonizing newcomers. It's about understanding impact, because when migration overlaps with debates about voter ID, when migration overlaps with citizenship verification, or it overlaps with, trust fractures, the stakes compound. The state that once leaned solidly red can become purple. And a purple state can then tip blue, and blue states can harden in policies before residents even flee. Every move alters the balance, and the balance determines Senate control, House control, Electoral College outcomes, federal policy direction. Demographics reshape power. That's not theory, that's math, and math doesn't care about your feelings, which is why sovereignty, the idea that is a defined body of citizens, determines its own future, keeps surfacing on this debate. Because if identity fragments the electorate, if migration reshapes the map, if verification becomes optional, the question intensifies. Who exactly is governing? And this brings us to the importance of the phrase that gets distorted constantly, and that's sovereignty. Let's define the word sovereignty properly. Sovereignty means a nation governs itself through its citizens under its laws. That's it. It does not mean hostility towards immigrants, towards minorities, towards any religion. It means by definition what I just said. A sovereign nation defines who is a citizen, who votes, how elections are verified, and which laws govern. Without clarity in those areas, sovereignty dissolves. And once sovereignty dissolves, governance becomes unstable. Protecting citizenship standards is not anti-immigrant. Protecting voter verification is not anti-minority. And protecting constitutional supremacy is not anti-religion. It's pro-structure. It's pro-Constitution of America. It's pro-America. And here's the reality. If the body of the voters is undefined, the direction of the nation becomes undefined. The verification is inconsistent. Trust becomes inconsistent. If law bends to, fractional pressure, neutrality disappears. Sovereignty is not a fucking slogan. It's the guardrail that keeps a republic intact. And guardrails are not They're not oppressive. They're there to prevent you from falling off the edge. They're there to prevent collapse. And when people hear sovereignty, they imagine exclusion. But sovereignty is actually what protects inclusion, because it ensures every citizen's vote carries equal weight under equal law. Without defining citizenship, equality fractures. The thing that these Democrats are always saying, this equality word, if you don't have actual citizenship, then there is no equality. Without consistent verification, then legitimacy weakens. Without constitutional supremacy, fractions or factions compete for dominance. When factions compete for dominance, the loudest or most organized bloc wins, not necessarily the constitutional majority, okay? That's not democracy strengthening. It's fragmentation, and that's what Democrats are constantly pushing. They want to divide this country. Republicans, conservatives are constantly trying to pull this country together. Sovereignty is the discipline that keeps emotion from overtaking structure. It is the reminder that a nation must know who it politically is in order to survive, because once sovereignty is defined, once governance is anchored in law, once citizenship is clarified, the only question left is what happens if we abandon the structure entirely. And once you define sovereignty, once you defend citizenship, once you protect the constitutional boundaries, you arrive at a fork in the road, because a republic does not drift forever. It either reinforces its structure or it weakens it. There is no permanent middle ground. America does not run on sentiment. It does not run on trending hashtags or emotional narratives or freaking demographic momentum. It runs on law. Law requires definition. Defined citizenship, defined verification, defined constitutional authority. When those definitions blur, stability weakens. Not overnight, not in dramatic collapse, slowly. When citizenship becomes symbolic instead of enforced, when verification becomes controversial, instead of routine, when constitutional supremacy becomes negotiable instead of the absolute law of the land, that's how erosion happens. A republic does not fall because people disagree. It falls when the rules governing disagreement stop being trusted and stop being enforced. When the ballot becomes suspect, when enforcement becomes selective, and when identity outranks citizenship, that's when chaos reaps in. Not tanks in the streets, uncertainty in the system. And uncertainty is corrosive because when people stop believing the structure works, they stop respecting the structure. And once respect for, the structure of governance fades, the loudest fractions are going to dominate. And you already know who the loudest one is. Those people are out there screaming their lungs off right now while we sit and act normal. It's definitely not the constitutional majority out there. It's not the lawful process. The loudest pressure, the most organized bloc, the most mobilized identity, that is not Republican governance. That is tribal politics. And tribal politics fractures nations, which is why the entire conversation, religion, citizenship, voter ID, migration, sovereignty comes down to something even simpler. It's identity. It's not heritage. It's not ancestry. It's not even ideology. It's civic identity. Because if a republic is going to survive demographic shifts, it's going to survive partisan warfare. It's going to survive distrust and migration and cultural friction, because that's something that's going to happen in any culture all the time. It must anchor itself in one shared political identity. And that's where we bring this home tonight, guys. Everything we've talked about tonight, faith, law, citizenship, voter ID, migration, sovereignty, all converges here on identity. Not cultural identity and not your ancestral identity, but civic identity. Because a republic can't survive as a coalition of prefixes. It survives as a nation of citizens. You can honor your heritage. You can celebrate your ancestry. You can practice your faith freely. That is the beauty of America. But when it comes to governance, when it comes to the ballot, there is only one political identity that matters, and that's American. The Constitution does not recognize hyphenated voting rights. It does not distinguish between demographic blocks at the ballot. It doesn't weigh ancestry. It recognizes citizens only. Equal protection under the law does not come with a suffix. It comes with citizenship. And when identity becomes tribal, politics becomes fractional, and they become untrusted. When politics become untrusted, they're unstable. So this is when us, citizens, need to unite. A republic built on prefixes fractures under pressure. A republic built on shared civic identity withstands it. This is not about erasing culture. Culture is personal. Heritage is personal. Your faith is personal. But citizenship is civic, and the ballot is civic. When you step into a voting booth, you're not a subgroup. You are a demographic strategy. You're not a hyphen. You're an American citizen participating in a constitutional system that protects your rights equally, regardless of your background. That's the anchor, that's the stabilizer, and that's the firewall against fragmentation. If we lose that, if we allow civic identity to dissolve into some kind of tribal categories, then every election becomes a battle of blocks instead of a decision of citizens. And when blocks displace citizens, the republic weakens. But when citizenship remains primary, when the Constitution remains supreme, when verification remains consistent, then sovereignty remains defined. The structure is going to hold, no matter the demographic shifts, no matter the religious changes, no matter the migration patterns. The structure holds. And that's the difference between a country that drifts and a republic that endures. It's about ballots, borders, the Constitution. Who actually governs America? Not trending narratives, it's not demographic pressure, it's not religious doctrine, and it's definitely not factional blocks. The Constitution is what governs America, and the citizens who operate within it. Tonight wasn't about fear, it wasn't about attacking anyone's faith, it's not about demonizing migration or erasing heritage. It's about drawing lines that keep our republic intact. Freedom of religion, protected. Civil law, supreme. Citizenship, defined. Verification, consistent. Sovereignty, preserved. That's not extreme. That's structure. A nation without defined citizenship becomes unstable. An election without trusted verification becomes suspect. And a government without constitutional supremacy becomes factional. A factional government does not endure. America works because the rules are clear. The Constitution is what governs us. Citizens vote. Laws apply equally. There's no prefixes at the ballot box, no parallel legal systems, no shifting standards depending on who benefits. Just American citizens participating in a constitutional republic. That clarity is not oppression. That's protection. It protects Christians, it protects Muslims, atheists, immigrants who become citizens, every lawful voter equally. Structure is not cruelty. Structure is stability. And if we want this country to, endure beyond news cycles and election seasons, then structure has to matter more than narrative. That's the conversation. That's the line. And that's what we defend here at the New Conservative Radio Show. This is NINJ. This is 4547blog.com. This is the New Conservative Radio Show. Hold the Constitution, hold the line, and we'll see you next time.